Childhood trauma. What is your childhood trauma? I'll do you one better. Where is your childhood trauma? I'll do you one better. Why is your childhood trauma? Why is my trauma what? It's a reference, you friggin' MCU casual. Drax deserved so much better.
Hello, my chronically indulgent consumers of the interwebs. Welcome to Horror Convos, kicking off its newest build with all of my starting attribute points locked into maxing out charisma, speech, and luck for the best odds of a successful podcast. Shut up, I have not been playing too many RPGs. Don't you know that reality is the greatest simulation of all? Wake up and smell the lukewarm heated robot semen, pod people. It's time to do some physics-defying kung fu fighting with Walter Cronkite.
Like the dinosaur.
I'm your host, Keith Harris, and by the time this episode is over, you might view me as just a little bit less sane. Horror Convos is a podcast for some relaxing, casual, and occasionally funny chit-chat about, you guessed it, horror.
Oh, that's why they call it that.
I regularly have guests on to voice their thoughts, some recurring if I can manage to bribe them again. Look forward to an interview with a special guest of mine later this episode. Think of it kind of like those conversations you had with your friends in college, between classes, killing time you could have spent more productively studying, doing recreational drugs, placating the ensuing munchies with cheap vending machine ramen, and waxing some taint-deep philosophy along with pushing your opinions on how to easily solve the latest issues in, politics, racism, the economy, world hunger, all while waiting for your next course to start. Memories.
He sounds way too nerdy to be a stoner.
We hold regular polls where you vote to decide on what will be discussed on our For the Fans episodes, and I encourage you to share your unfiltered 2 cents on this episode's subject in the comments below. Today's topic covers a question arguably as old as humanity itself, possibly even older, depending on whether there is in fact intelligent life out there. It would be the first. It's the question that brought you here. You know the question, just as I did.
Alright, I get it!
What is your childhood trauma? What was your introduction to horror? How did those experiences influence your preferences for horror? Essentially, what are you currently seeing a shrink for?
Goodbye, everyone. I'll remember you all in therapy.
Has this question already been discussed and probably given a detailed answer by one of the literal hundreds of other horror podcasts out there? Very likely, but I never said or implied that this show was original. It's just you listening to a stranger talking to a mic. Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. So now that I've set the stage, laid down the ground rules, and just about finished editing in all the humorous sound bites I found online, let's light them up, knock them back, dive in, some other colloquial for substance abuse, and hope we can get all the stuff worth listening to uploaded onto a coherent sound file before my team and I officially start tripping every single one of the balls.
The mushrooms are turning on me.
So I guess it would be fitting for me to start by trauma dumping on all of you, with your consent, of course, about my history with horror that helped mold me into the occasionally semi-well-adjusted man I am today.
It all started when I was born.
No, we don't need to go into details of how my parents and doctors immediately laughed at the size of my So probably my earliest memories of anything horror-related would be the classic stuff, like so embedded in the pop cultural zeitgeist that you'd have a hard time finding someone who hasn't at least heard of them. Like, even in one of those few remaining isolated tribes so far removed from civilization that even third world countries might turn their nose up at them, chances are that someone there has their own version of one or more of these, classic horror narratives. Do not visit the Sentinelese tribe.
Flawless pronunciation.
Hey, but as far as what story specifically, it was the usual gateway stuff. The boogeyman is the earliest I can recall off the top of my head. I presume that just about every culture has their own version of that general concept, of some entity that lives in the darkness and will kidnap, kill, and or devour you if you misbehave, or something to that effect, or it just makes you disappear into the shadows, never to be seen or heard from again. And if you stay out after dark, don't go to bed on time, don't say your prayers, don't kiss your grandma in the mouth, etc. But most of those, from what I understand, are Historically, just cautionary tales about morality or consequences, generally things under the umbrella of cause and effect, with the intent of instilling specific values and behaviors into the listener. They were commonly things that parents used to scare their kids straight because, physical abuse only works for so long before either the kids develop a higher pain tolerance or the parents are too exhausted after their daily labor. The kids might grow up to be mental cases, kill their family in their sleep, whatever. But yeah, I guess that's where my relationship with horror really started. I heard others like The Legends of El Chupacabra, Mothman, The Jersey Devil, also one of my favorite video games. Someone please give it the Spyro remake treatment. My grandmother told my sisters and I a few scary stories when we were a little older, or that she claimed were true accounts from the small town where she grew up in the Appalachian Mountains. It's still there last I checked. If you Google it, it's a Pound, Virginia. Very rural country, very isolated. You could put it as a picture in the dictionary next to the definition of small town. You look up photos of it and it looks almost kind of like Silent Hill, which was not inspired from Centralia, Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. Frickin' movies. I started off mostly with just basic children's fables and campfire tales, some Brothers Grimm stuff here and there, I think, though I was mostly introduced to that mythology through Disney's more lighthearted adaptations first. As far as the first series of stories or lore that I committed to, this likely isn't a surprise, it was Goosebumps. Yeah, those books were my jam for years, man. Like, that series was one of the first to help me really develop my reading skills as a young lad. Yeah, I can remember looking through the Scholastic book fairs like a kid in a candy store every time it came back to my school, good times. You modern whippersnappers might not know what I'm talking about, but trust me, for a lot of us 90s kids, the annual book fair was one of my favorite parts of the school year, and I can remember pleading for my mom to get me the newest books, from the Guinness World Records to those thinner DK Eyewitness series books. I still actually have one of those, the one about spies. Yeah, my favorite 4 that I read, I believe, were the ones on spies, sharks, bats, and spiders. But above all, Goosebumps usually won out. I was drawn to those creepy, badass book covers, especially the more glittery ones from later in the series.
Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow.
I'd read the plot summaries on the back, and if I found one that really hooked me, I'd plead for it sometimes because certain ones were only at the fairs. The school library didn't have all of them. The public library where we lived back then didn't always have them. I wasn't a collector per se, like not every Goosebumps plot interested me. The same goes for the TV series, which I got into around the same time, I think. But I'm pretty sure I was exposed to the books first. The book covers of those were the scariest Slappy the Dummy ever looked, in my opinion. They gave his face more personality, I guess you could say, in the show's version, but it wasn't as scary to me. The movies were closer to how he originally looked. I think in the books. The Haunted Mask was the opposite. The series went so much harder with the mask's designs compared to the books. The scene where they start floating and chasing Carly Beth with that eerie motion blur gave me nightmares for God knows how long. That and her creepy talking mannequin head going, "Help me, please, help me."
Masha.
Dude, I think my relationship with creepy dolls, mannequins, and statues can actually all be traced back to that original 2-part episode. For a lot of people, it was maybe the Twilight Zone's After Hours episode, Child's Play, Doctor Who's Weeping Angels, Tourist Trap. That's a good one, very underrated movie. Or the old Trilogy of Terror anthology with that tribal doll that comes to life. All those usual suspects. For me, it was The Haunted Mask. Everything else came later, as far as I remember. But the Goosebumps show went hard, man. Even as an adult, I've rewatched it on Netflix, and episodes like The Haunted Mask, Werewolf of Fever Swamp, every Night of the Living Dummy episode, Night in Terror Tower, Stay Out of the Basement especially. Parts of those scared me more than stuff I'd seen back then that was made for adults. They got away with a lot for a show aimed at kids that young. You know, it's what I'd consider one of the quintessential children's franchises of the 90s. And that's funny because tonally it feels in several ways like something that would fit more in the 80s, just because kids' media, especially horror, was often darker back then compared to today. You know, PG meant a lot more back then. And to a point, at least, you know, we've seen a resurgence in darker kid stuff, I think, since the 2000s. You know, a few of Cartoon Network's modern shows are definitely at least psychologically more mature than a lot of what I grew up on. Yeah, R.L. Stine was basically Stephen King light for my generation, you know, Diet King. And he's well aware of how people compared him to King in that way, too, that they actually know each other, that they've met at, on at least one occasion before at conventions, I believe, and they've joked about it with each other. Or I think their spouses are, or at the time were friends, too. So by late middle school, going into ninth grade, they did like just starting into that transition into high school. I'd obviously started to outgrow Goosebumps, and as if the universe was magically aware of that, next thing I know, I see 2 new series at my high school library. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Big influence on R.L. Stine among many horror authors and fans. I don't recall my elementary or middle school libraries having it, but those illustrations, man, just wow. It was like a whole other level from the worst stuff I'd seen from Goosebumps. You know, Stephen Gammell's art style was metal. It was unforgettable. Those pictures, I can still recall them in such detail in my brain. I haven't even looked at one of those books in years, but it's just it really just burns into your psyche. Like, I was scared to look at some of them for more than a couple to a few seconds at a time. You know, in my child mind, I mean, no exaggeration, it was like looking at something that had been drawn by aliens or the devil. You know, so many kids today trace their early memories of scary-looking stuff to internet creepypastas, and those are good stuff, too. I'm not making light of them, but Slender Man, Smile Dog, The Russian Sleep Experiment, Jeff the Killer, The Rake, The Smiling Man, NES Godzilla, yeah, all those scariest videos on the internet, looking at it will make you go insane contenders that were hot for a while. Yeah, for me, none of those were even in the same league of This Image Makes Me Uncomfortable as the original Scary Stories books. So, you know, very few artists are able to draw something that hits me that hard, and I've went down a rabbit hole of looking at a lot of it at one time in my life, just because I wanted to see what else was out there, or who else had this kind of talent. You know, Gamble was one of my inspirations growing up as an artist myself. He was one of the first examples to show me just how far the envelope can be pushed to make something look simultaneously scary and yet strangely almost mesmerizing or beautiful once you get past the initial expected shock and disgust. You know, the only other pictures I can think of before that left me creeped out and transfixed at the same time are probably the Mona Lisa and Edvard Munch's The Scream. It almost makes me think back to the old H.P. Lovecraft story Pickman's Model. If you've ever read that or listened to the audiobook or seen one of the many adaptations of it, like the newest one in Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities anthology. The second series I fell in love with around this time was R.L. Stine's slightly more grounded horror literature franchise Fear Street. Now, if you only know that name from the recent trilogy of adaptations on Netflix, no worries. I didn't know many people growing up who had heard of them. These books, understandably, were never quite at the level of being as well known as Goosebumps, and I think one main reason for that is probably because they were geared more toward teenagers, and the teen audience ultimately just wasn't as big as the younger kids who, you know, gravitated toward Goosebumps. Another reason is likely because with this series, Stein tried to move away from the more overtly fantastical monsters and supernatural elements that were more common in his kids' books. That there were stories in the Fear Street series that still went into paranormal territory, but on average, these books revolved more around murder mysteries like what you would have seen in slashers from like the 80s or 90s. He tried to do something relatively more realistic and relatable, I guess, that played more on horrors that could take place in the real world. And it was definitely a more mature series. Like, that was the most immediately noticeable change in tone from Goosebumps. It still wasn't as dark as Stephen King, but it could get fairly close. You know, people died regularly in these books. Kids died, usually teens. There was more blood, graphic descriptions of gore. I still have an old copy of the first Fear Street book I read, which is also the first one that caught my eye that day in the library. It's called Lights Out, not to be confused with the awesome horror short film or its unfortunately less effective feature-length film adaptation. This book was set at a summer camp with a premise very obviously inspired from the original Friday the 13th. I'd recommend it. It's a quality entry for people wanting to try out the series, and no spoilers, but there is a rather grisly death in this story, and I recall the first time I read it, it painted such a picture that I remember actually trembling while reading it. It surprised me that this was written by the same guy who did Goosebumps, but you can definitely still see Stein's writing style in here. I don't know how to describe it. It's like how my gran always said that she could recognize Stephen King's writing even when he was going under one of his pseudonyms. He just has that way with words, and I do believe you could say the same about Stein. So I read all the Fear Street books I could find until, like with Goosebumps, my interests just started to change. You know, the later stories weren't as good in my opinion compared to the earlier ones. So after that, I pretty much stopped reading Stein altogether, kind of just fell out of love with him as an author. But again, I do absolutely recommend it. There are generally at least a little longer stories in this series, like decently longer than any of the Goosebumps books from what I remember. They're more like short novels or novellas, but you can still finish one of them in like a day if you get really hooked into it.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
So now for my big firsts in movies. I have seen the classics, of course, you know, Hammer Horror, the old Universal monsters and all that. I mean, they were everywhere in pop culture long before I was born, so you couldn't realistically at least know of them. But those weren't my gateway. I'm sure I saw bits and pieces of them on TV growing up, but I didn't really sit down to watch through them until years later. And being brutally honest, while I totally respect them as like quintessential classics, I never really got into them. The Wolfman and Mummy looked cool. The Invisible Man was creepy as an idea. I think he would have made for a great supervillain origin story had he been created for comics. The creature from the Black Lagoon was legitimately scary. You know, the Gillman suit is possibly the best I've seen in old school practical effects suits from that era. You know, even if you can tell it's clearly a guy in a suit, the design itself still holds up for its creativity and intimidation and factor and just the uncanniness and in the face. Frankenstein's monster had a genuinely creepy makeup with those messed up proportions of his head and, you know, Boris Karloff's iconic sad face. He was probably the first concept of a tragic character that really stuck with me. He was never really the monster of that story, despite being famously called the monster or Frankenstein's monster. He was more of the victim than anything, and in both the Karloff classic and many adaptations, and as well as Mary Shelley's original story. The film that popped my horror cherry before anything else was probably Jaws. That's my earliest on-screen horror memory. And that film made me afraid to swim in the ocean for, I mean, Lord knows how many years. Even lakes, like my grandparents' house at Lake Gaston, I was nervous to swim there for a while because, for one, it's lake water. You can't see much of anything in it. It's very murky under the surface, very brown and green the closer you get to the bottom. And of course, at the bottom, it's darker. It wasn't polluted, the water itself was as clean as any lake I've been to. I just didn't like not being able to see down there even with goggles on. And also the day I first learned about bull sharks and how they're one of the only species that can survive in both salt and fresh water. I was actually more afraid of bull sharks than the great white growing up, specifically because of that fact. I heard rumors of people dumping baby bull sharks into some lakes or rivers around the country just to let them grow and potentially see them attack the local fish, animals, or people, swimmers. My family and I used to visit a place called Echo Lake Park in Glen Allen, and I believe it's in Glen Allen. And there was a rumor or a news story at one point that I think some asshole supposedly released a small bull shark he'd caught into there, and it was supposedly discovered later by a park goer after it had grown some. I guess animal control was called to deal with it, presumably. But just the idea of that put me off swimming in any deep body of water for quite a few years, except for pools. And of course, I had nightmares about being lost in deep water, being lost at sea, for instance, not being able to see anything under me. And next thing you know, I end up like poor Chrissy Watkins at the beginning of Jaws. Yeah, many of my first movie-related nightmares were from that movie. Chrissy Watkins' chewed up body, Hooper holding up her severed arm during his examination, the poor little boy Alex Kintner being dragged under in that geyser of blood. That was my first memory of seeing a child die on screen, and I realized, like, holy shit, that kid's barely older than me. Like, nobody's off limits for this thing. It was my first time seeing gore and dismemberment, like the guy rowing his boat in the pond who gets his leg bitten off, Ben Gardner's head jump scaring us, and Hooper with that missing eyeball, Quint getting bitten in half. That was first time I saw anyone spit up blood. I was way too young to have seen this film when I did, and without question, it made one of the biggest, longest lasting impacts on me of any movie, for better or worse. All that said, I love Jaws to no end. It instantly became one of my all-time favorite movies, and remains so to this day, partially because of how it traumatized me. I can rewatch it any time of year. I seriously can't count how many times I've watched it. It's well into the hundreds at this point, I'm sure. I'm 31 years old, so that sounds about right. I've watched every documentary I think there is on it. I can quote more of this film from beginning to end, honestly more than I could with anything else. Like, I can do a fairly convincing Quint impression, but you'll have to go to Patreon to hear that. I can quote more from Jaws off the top of my head than I can from Star Wars. Like, that's how big this was for me. And I'm also a lifelong Star Wars nerd. But I became obsessed with sharks for a while, man. Like, I loved seeing them in aquariums, as creepy as some of them were to be that close to, especially the sand tigers with those piercing eyes and gnarly teeth. I loved petting small sharks in those areas where you could touch them under employee supervision. And that was really my first exposure to them as, viewing them as just animals. And I saw, oh, hey, they're not all scary. They're not bloodthirsty demons and such. They're fish. I bought so many shark toys. I reenacted scenes on the orca in my sandbox outside, playing with my toy shark in the sand, or pretending I was sinking and had to blow it up. I built a detailed copy of the orca from my Legos, and then I'd play with that in the bathtub and reenact it there with my toy shark tearing the Lego boat apart until it sank. Then I'd collect all my Legos, dry them off, and rebuild the boat next time I took a bath. God, I did that so many times. Yeah, I'd stay in that bathtub playing for like so long till my fingers got pruny. Man. I would say that I'm mostly over my fear of sharks and swimming in the ocean today. I've gone to Myrtle Beach with my dad's family just about every summer since I was little, but I still never swim out past a certain point where the water's reaching my neck. You know, lakes and rivers, I'll do whatever. I am still very much interested in sharks. I would watch Shark Week almost every year growing up, though I have unfortunately missed it the past few years. What else? Jurassic Park. Arguably not really horror as much, but those dinosaurs haunted my dreams for a while nonetheless. The Headless Horseman was a big one. I was obsessed with that for a while. Indulged in a lot of movies, shows, and books related to it. Like most kids from my generation, I saw the Disney version first. Then 1999's computer-animated made-for-TV film Night of the Headless Horseman, which stuck with me for a while. That was my first time seeing someone decapitated.
Decapitation!
After that, I got another dose of trauma from Sleepy Hollow. That one is still my personal favorite take on the classic story. Well, one of my favorite Johnny Depp films. You know, it may not be one of his best performances, but I really liked his take on Ichabod Crane. Apart from that, there was Lake Placid. First time I saw what someone looked like after being bitten in half. Blade, John Carpenter's Vampires, and From Dusk Till Dawn were the first films where vampires scared me. All three very gory at points. Halloween, of course. Michael Myers freaked me out as a kid, you know, with that white mask and that, like, mannequin expressionless face hiding the devil's eyes behind in the eye holes. Rest in peace, Donald Pleasance. I've seen all of those except for the most recent trilogy that started in 2018. I have no desire to watch any of those. Nothing against, you know, Jamie Lee Curtis or the people who worked on it. I just lost interest in the franchise after Rob Zombie's films. I know what happens in the newest trilogy. You know, I've watched reviews for it. I just don't really care to see them. I've lost my love for the dynamic of the series because it just got so increasingly repetitive over time. I'm just over Michael Myers in general at this point. I'll always have love for the older films and H2O as well. But yeah, it just doesn't really do it for me anymore. Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street I actually didn't see much of back then. Again, I knew of them, like everybody knew Jason and Freddy. I just didn't sit down to watch them until I was older. At that time, I was more into Halloween or Scream than anything else. Scream was good. First time I saw someone gutted. God, poor Drew Barrymore. I remember seeing her in E.T. before I watched Scream. She was so adorable and little. She grew up to be so pretty, one of my first celebrity crushes, and Ghostface was so mean to her. Well, that stabbing and cutting wasn't nice. Anyway, so Pet Sematary 1989 was my gateway into zombies, along with, you know, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn, Day, etc. I've talked about that in the last episode. Timmy Baterman and Little Undead Gage messed me up good. On the bright side, it also introduced me to the Ramones, still my favorite end credit song for any horror movie to date. Starship Mother-Lovin' Troopers. Again, not really horror, except in the gore department. That was more of an action flick and arguably the best anti-propaganda film to this day. Yeah, many people continue to misunderstand it as, like, pro-propaganda, pro-fascism, or a parody of the military-industrial complex. It was pretty overtly anti-propaganda, like a very clever commentary in that regard. I mean, I understood that even as a kid. It surprises me how many people still miss that or misinterpret it, but those bugs and the many ways they mutilated people, yeah, no bueno. Stabbing, dismembering, melting, sucking brains out. The sequel, Heroes of the Federation, added the far freakier idea of literal brain replacing bugs that come out of people's mouths and wear them as slowly rotting meat suits. Yeah, definitely a body horror buffet with that franchise. I lost interest after the third film, Marauder, though. That one wasn't as good, in my opinion, even though I did like, Casper Van Dien coming back as Johnny Rico. Not as gory either. I think the series got less scary after the first two, more action-heavy. Cronenberg's The Fly and The Fly 2, more bug-related nightmares. That security guard's face full of acid is my earliest memory of a face melting, apart from Raiders of the Lost Ark. The original Fly was also effective with that sudden reveal of the big fly head on the human body, and later the little human caught in the spider's web. I'm talking about the old version. Then Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, again, not technically horror, but that giant scorpion, no thanks. I never cried over the death of an ant before, but yeah, that did it. Alien, of course, the face hugger, chest burster, adult xenomorph's design, that second tongue, big yikes to all of it. The Terminator and Terminator 2, more sci-fi thriller than horror, but again, very effective body horror. The metal under the bloody flesh, the T-1000 copying John's foster mom and that cop before stabbing. Them both. With the in the stepmom's case, it was the foster dad and whatever. Arnold's performance in general, but especially the effect of ripping the flesh off his own arm in T2 to show the mechanics to Miles Dyson and his wife. T3 years later with the TX punching through that poor guy's gut in the car. Ugh. Now we get into the late 90s! There was The Mummy with Brendan Fraser. Those Egyptian scarab beetles freaked me the hell out with the scenes of them eating people and digging under their skin. The sarcophagus filled with them that was sealed up with Imhotep inside. Holy shit. Obviously Imhotep himself, when he was rotted and first came back to life, the CGI is dated and in some respects, but I still think the design itself holds up pretty well. The effects of him regenerating over time stuck with me. Saw, I've seen all of those.
I want to play a game. Live or die. Make your choice.
My dad and I went to see at least the first 7 in theaters. He doesn't recall us seeing that many in theaters, but I'm positive we did. Like, no one else in my family would have been interested. He and I both agree that the first one was and remains the best. Nightmare fuel of a concept, the idea of being jumped and sedated out of nowhere when I'm alone, then, kidnapped and waking up in a room with those traps and some psycho passing judgment on me for how I've lived my life, having to potentially cut one of my own limbs off or kill someone else to escape. At that time, that was one of the scariest, most semi-realistic scenarios I'd seen in a film. I was afraid to go out alone at night for a little bit because I was afraid some nut might get inspired to become a real-life Jigsaw. But, yeah, Tobin Bell's voice coming out of that doll Billy, especially in the original when he rides in on that tricycle. I certainly appreciated my life more after seeing that original movie. The sequels were where it got increasingly silly for me. That's also where it went more into torture porn territory. A lot of people label the whole franchise that way, but if you pay attention, the original film, it's really not that bloody. There's actually very little on-screen violence in it. Most of the worst stuff, it cuts off of it so fast that you only get a split second to see it, or the majority of the time it happens off screen. It's implied with the sound of the squishy body parts and stuff, and the worst one in my opinion is Lawrence sawing his foot off. But even then, you only see a couple to a few seconds of him starting into the skin. But nonetheless, the implication of it really was definitely chilling. Dude, I remember with the ending, my jaw dropped the same moment as Leigh Whannell's character Adam. Our whole theater was gasping at that twist finale. It was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had in a theater. Thumper from A Bug's Life, kind of freaky. Ants, and the big termite battle with them like melting the ants with acid. And yeah, that one. And what once again, and way too young to have seen that. It's a great movie though, in spite of Woody Allen being a part of it. Asian horror I got big into throughout the 2000s. So, that really introduced me to looking into the original Japanese, Korean, and Thai versions, and so on as well. Ju-on, Ringu, Dark Water, Cairo, aka Pulse, One Missed Call, Shudder, Tiki Tiki, Consent, Infection, The Slit-Mouthed Woman. I discovered like so much once I branched out into foreign films as well as the American remakes. I couldn't finish The Grudge the first time I tried that scene everyone knows with the bloody Kayako crawling down the stairs with that death rattle choking out. That was just too much for me. Anthology horror I was way big on. I'll get more into that later. Creep Show, of course. Body Bags, I saw that when I was little. My favorite was the last story with Mark Hamill losing his eye and getting a replacement that belonged to a serial killer. Then he starts seeing what the killer saw until the eye starts possessing him or something. The part where he's in bed with his wife and hallucinates her as one of the killer's victims. That part caught me off guard. That and the part where he's cleaning something in the sink or trying to fix the garbage disposal or something, and then he hallucinates like a victim's hand and grabbing at him from inside the drain. And then he like flashes back and it's not there anymore. Yeah, oh boy. The last traumatic movie I can think of is probably 2008's Boogeyman. Underrated film, not a masterpiece by any means, but the way it portrayed the monster specifically stuck with me. That piss poor CGI actually made it look more uncanny to look at for me. Another good song in the credits too, Falling Home by Noisehead. It's not a high recommendation for me as a movie, especially not the sequels. They went downhill fast, but that first 2008 film you might like. This is Future Keith speaking. After a quick Google check, I just realized that Boogeyman actually came out in 2005, not 2008. The Land Before Time, of course. There's another beauty. But animated dinosaurs, Sharptooth. Yeah, kind of freaky when you're real little. Secretive Nim, the Great Owl, and those rats, with the electric spears. An American Tail, Fievel Goes West, that scorpion scene, stuck with me for a while after the first time I saw it. I just had a phase where I was really afraid of scorpions. So, with that, we've done books, movies. Let's focus more on how television and direct-to-video, scarred me.
There is nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture.
So, I believe I started by watching the original Addams Family on and off. I learned to snap because of that song. The 90s movies were my personal favorite version. That's the one I was most exposed to. But I do also really love Jenna Ortega as Wednesday. The Munsters, I don't think I watched much. I was aware of it, but the first time I saw Fred Gwynn was Pet Sematary. That's more what I associate him with. Sometimes Dead is Butta, not better, Butta. Scooby-Doo gave me a few scares growing up, the original show. Hands down, the most it ever scared me was Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. Still the best Scooby movie ever made, in my opinion. The sequel can burn in Mount Doom. But yeah, when Fred tried to pull a mask off that one zombie and pulled its head off instead, then it twisted it back on, and I was like, yikes, this shit's real this time, dude. It's a terrifying time. And those werecats, those were nightmare fuel. Jacques the Ferryman, his transformation freaked me out mainly because it happened so fast. It was like an animated jump scare, and it surprised me because I didn't expect him to be one of the bad guys. I knew it wasn't Bo because he was too obvious of a red herring. but I liked Jacques, so, I didn't suspect him. The whole Scooby franchise, I think, was my gateway into horror comedy. That and Tremors, the scary movie films, and Shaun of the Dead, all great stuff. Cried laughing one moment with Shaun and lost my appetite the next. Some people were raised on Abbott and Costello. For me, it was the Mystery Gang. Batman the Animated Series had a few episodes that got to me. Any episode with the ventriloquist and his dummy Scarface was creepy. We went over the Goosebumps show. I also watched Are You Afraid of the Dark, Tales from the Dark Side, Stephen King's Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Tales from the Crypt I was big on, like one of the best, most nightmarishly constructed intros I'd ever seen growing up. And even today, I'd say it's still, if not the best, definitely one of the ones that set the benchmark. The Crypt Keeper puppet was a work of art. I wanted to visit that haunted house as I got older. If you invited me onto any of the sets, I would have been there in a second. Yeah, there were a couple mature cartoons that I grew up with. Them Real Monsters from 1994. I mean, that one was made for kids. That's Nickelodeon, but those designs definitely stuck with me. The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy was more funny than scary to me, but there were times when it went into like some dark territory, if y'all remember from some of those plot lines. Dude, Courage the Cowardly Dog. I don't know how some of those episodes got greenlit by Cartoon Network. But it was one of my favorite shows growing up. But holy crap, that was like my gateway into like legitimate animated horror. Because some of those episodes, like the first Cats episode, the Cats Motel with those spiders, the You're Not Perfect episode with those like nightmare sequences that Courage would have, like the one with that freaky white head with the wire coming out of it. You're not perfect. At their best, some of the episodes were more humorous in it than anything, but they were still like disturbing. They almost always had this underlying veneer of just making you uncomfortable. Yeah, well, when they wanted to go hard into horror territory, they really pushed it. Return the slab. Ramses, of course, the man in gauze. The man in gauze, the man in gauze. Yeah, Lord, did that song get stuck in my head for a while. Well, catchy. Yeah, and some of those episodes delved into surprisingly adult themes that I didn't really pick up on until I was older, like the one about the cat and the bunny, trying to get away from that evil dog ex-boyfriend of theirs, and the cat had like a prejudice against all dogs that she took out on Courage until he proved he was one of the good ones. And so, there were some really poignant themes of like prejudice and, the bunny and the cat quite obviously being like a lesbian couple. Only, they never say it, but it's like pretty heavily hinted at. Courage. Yeah, man. You definitely had to have courage to get through some of those episodes. The biggest TV impact for me was 100% Stephen King's It, the 1990 miniseries. Dude, that shit fucked me up. I could talk about that for like a whole episode. Just damn, like first time I saw a little boy that young get killed. He was younger than Alex Kintner in Jaws, I think. First time I saw someone after they'd committed suicide with a Stan in the bathtub. I never saw clowns the same way again, that's for sure. And I actually remember enjoying the circus when I was young. I never loved clowns, especially when they got in my face, but I don't recall looking at them like they were demons back then. And but Tim Curry as Pennywise, forget about it. I know I keep saying this way too young the first time I saw little Georgie meet Pennywise in that storm drain.
You float soul!
Fun fact, that whole section of street with the storm drain that Georgie, Tony Dakota is kneeling down on, that was all actually a set built above ground. You can see in behind the scenes photos and footage, it was high enough off the ground, stabilized by support beams with a ramp on the side for little Tony to walk up and down. Tim was standing with his head and arms showing in the drain. That set was designed and expertly framed so that when they shot that scene, I couldn't tell at first glance that it wasn't the real street. You know, I never would have known that just from watching it. If you're interested, I highly recommend the documentary Pennywise, The Story of It. It's all about the making of the miniseries, and you really learn a lot about how much went into that production, including a lot of stuff the creators wanted to do that ended up on the cutting room floor or was shot down by ABC Network because they were afraid it would be too dark. Yeah, a story about a clown that eats kids. Imagine that. But technically an interdimensional, shape-shifting alien force disguised as a clown, in a universe that was thrown up by a giant turtle. It's a whole thing, but as much as people make fun of the miniseries, it actually had a ton of stuff that went into it. You know, there was so much talent working on it that we didn't get to see. Even that goofy stop-motion spider, there was actually a lot more planned for that thing originally. It had animatronics, there were puppeteers, you see footage of the actors playing with it, manipulating the head. It was pretty badass. Definitely check this documentary out if you can. I watched it on Amazon Prime. Hopefully it's still there. So lastly, we'll cover the final medium of my childhood trauma, video games. Given my track record at this point, you might think I played the most sadistic shit out there. Truth be told, I was generally kind of a fraidy cat with horror games. I've discussed this before. I dabbled in Resident Evil on and off for years.
Resident Evil.
I was usually too scared to play them for long. The sound design typically creeped me out more than what was on screen, like the zombies moaning, the zombie dogs, jump scaring you with the barking, the lickers, Nemesis, etc.
Stars.
The ganado speaking that haunting Spanish. Yeah, it was the Spanish that did it specifically. I can admit that I'm prejudiced. What about it? Oh, Lord. Imagine if the zombies in China from Resident Evil 6 spoke Chinese and in like a similar creepy voice, or even better, like Japanese horror zombies. Just they lean deep into the Asian horror tropes and combine that with the undead tropes.
Speaking another language, I'm pretty sure it was
The Lost World arcade game definitely freaked me out. I did not like sitting in that box with those black curtains making everything darker, watching the T-Rex and raptors so close up to me on the screen. That could not have been good for people's eyes. Wonder if any parents ever sued the manufacturer for that, like blaming the game for their child needing glasses. I never even bothered with Dino Crisis, Resident Evil style gameplay with dinosaurs. That would have definitely been too much. My first zombie game before Resident Evil was actually The House of the Dead.
The House of the Dead.
They came out in the US the same year, 1996. I first came across it in the arcade at the mall where my family used to take me all the time. Yeah, that mall's torn down now, which is sad. A lot of memories there. But I will never forget when I heard the creepy music coming from that arcade machine for the first time. I was scared to even look at it initially because those were the most realistic looking zombies I'd seen at that point in a video game. And this was an arcade and that little kids, like kids younger than I was back then, could just run around, stop, and look at it. I can only imagine how many of them got nightmares just from going near this thing. It's like looking back, you would think the people in charge would have had the foresight to think, maybe we should have games like this in a back room of some kind that only kids of a certain age can enter to play them. Maybe we should ask for ID or only let them in with parent supervision. It just kind of amazes me, in retrospect, how it was perfectly acceptable for my 7 to 8-year-old self to be allowed to just stare at this clearly mature game, watching zombies get shot to pieces with blood flying everywhere. Yeah, these graphics, at least on the monsters, went so much harder than what the first Resident Evil was capable of technologically at the time. So needless to say, I did not want to play this thing at first. I dreaded walking by it every time I went into the arcade. But there were other more age-appropriate games there that I really liked. That they had air hockey, for crying out loud. I mean, there was nowhere else near us to play that game that I can recall back then. But eventually, once I started to overcome my fear and learned how to play, I was hooked. I played that thing every chance I could. I spent so much of my dad's money on tokens, like $20 worth per session sometimes. He started to play with me, and we'd get a crowd watching us occasionally, especially me. I got so good. All those violent video games, turns out they actually do make you a pretty good shot. Yeah, but no, honestly, it's surprising how well those skills translate into laser tag. Never beat the first House of the Dead, but I came so damn close. Like, I had the last boss on like his last little centimeter of health, but some of those attacks are just so unfairly difficult to dodge or counter in time. Like, I mean, granted, it's a game really made for 2 players, but it still felt kind of cheap. And I came that close, but I was out of tokens at that point and was not about to guilt my dad for more. We'd spent too much money at that point. But, I beat the second one years later while playing with this random guy that was already on it at Broadway at the beach at Myrtle Beach. So, got some satisfaction out of that. One thing I imagine everyone who played this game growing up remembers is how a certain word got drilled into our brains.
Reload!
I got into similar shooters like the Area 51 arcade shooter. Little bit of Doom, but I'm not an avid Doomer. Moved on to mostly console shooters after that, like the Left 4 Dead games. Had a blast with that. Like, I still have it. It's one of the last 360 games that I still own, that and Left 4 Dead 2 as well. Well, it still has a pretty active lobby from what I hear. I haven't had Xbox Live in years, so I haven't played online in a long time. Yeah, the last 2 from my formative years, I guess, would be Dead Space and BioShock. Those last 2 in particular had several moments where I nearly turned the game off. I was so freaked out. And that's pretty much it. Everything from then on gets into my mid to late teens, so alright, I think we've officially covered all my formative childhood trauma. God, it's like this weight's been lifted. At least if you're still listening by this point. I'm going to assume yes, so the effort doesn't feel completely meaningless. And now, with that, let's move on to the moment you've all been waiting, or more likely probably skipping around fast-forwarding to. The interview segment of the episode. My next guest is my stepdad, Bill. He is a trucker who has gone all around this country. He's seen a lot of strange things, but to date, he has seen nothing to suggest that some invisible energy field controls his destiny. His truck is not named the Millennium Falcon, but I suspect that's been a nerd fantasy of his forever. Before he goes back on the road again to haunt people listening in on their CB radios, we'll be having a little chat about horror. So, Bill, why don't you tell us a bit about what you grew up watching that kind of introduced you to horror?
When I was young, mostly the horror films that I watched, I kind of watched when I wasn't supposed to on HBO late at night after my parents went to bed. It was the Halloween series. I enjoyed that, especially when it gets around the Halloween season. What was the one? Friday the 13th with Jason. Did watch the first one of that one. But primarily, those were the two. Some things that I also watched, I believe it was American Werewolf in London.
Oh, nice.
And I did watch anything that I could find that was generally, what would you call it, like a shock scare? Or something that, would jump out at you.
Like anything with a good jump scare in it?
Jump scare, yeah, that's what you referred to. And those type of movies were the ones that would actually interest me in regards to horror.
Nice. He's covered the usual bases. And of course, you obviously remember that Jason's mom was the killer in the original Friday the 13th. Jason didn't show up until the sequel, so no one needs to put us on blast in the comments. We know. We've seen Scream. I own it on DVD. You're good. No need to gut my football player or boyfriend as I watch from him inside the living room. So, what about TV? As far as did you get into a lot of those anthology shows? It was like I know you mentioned the Twilight Zone and Tales from the Crypt.
Yeah, both of those were popular when I was younger. I watched those. I believe it was Creepshow was also anything that was on HBO that was kind of something that would put the scare into you. Some of them, raise the hair on your arms. Those kind of things that I would like to watch.
I definitely grew up with a few of those anthology shows where they did a different story every episode. I started off with Goosebumps, more that's more a product of the 90s. I think Tales from the Crypt may have started before the Goosebumps series. Goosebumps was more my gateway. I didn't watch the Twilight Zone growing up, except maybe in bits and pieces. I was aware of it, but I binged the whole series when it came onto Netflix. But before that, I don't recall anything beyond knowing the occasional references, like the monster on the plane at Nightmare at 20,000 feet. All the references they did in other shows that parodied it, like Family Guy and The Simpsons and so on, and spoofing Ron Sterling's things in narration or the do not adjust your television from the Outer Limits. Some
of the things that I watched first in the very beginning, what kind of got me into it was the monsters. Back when I was a kid, things that were horror were a lot different from what they are today. Because when I grew up, when I was younger, things that would scare me would be like werewolf, Dracula, Frankenstein. It was more that kind of got me into more the horror type stuff. And then, it kind of progressed from there.
And I can remember seeing pieces of the old school Hammer horror films growing up, and I definitely saw at least pieces of the original Wolfman, Frankenstein, but multiple different Draculas. I think my earliest memory was probably Christopher Lee's version. I didn't grow up with the original one that I think what's his name, Bela Lugosi.
Bela Lugosi was the one I watched.
The earliest version I can think of is Christopher Lee. And of course Bram Stoker, so Dracula with Gary Oldman. My grandmother that was in love with that version. And
I did like that one a lot. That was very well done.
Yeah, not the best Van Helsing thing in whoever it was that Keanu Reeves played. I forget if he played Van Helsing or some other character, but definitely not one of Keanu's best roles, in my opinion. And I don't think that's necessarily his fault. I'm just not sure he was the best casting for what the material demanded of him at the time, because this would have been a good... I know it was a good few years before The Matrix. That was 1999, but before that, I think he was only really known for the Bill and Ted movies, which started in the 80s. So I'm not sure he'd really gotten a lot of experience at dramatic acting at the time. And because what really first made him known, I think, was it was more comedy with Bill and Ted, and he had a Scanner Darkly, of course, but I think that was also more later into the 90s. Scanners too. I think no, not Scanners. A Scanner Darkly. either that or Hackers, maybe. It was something he starred in that had kind of a cyberpunk thing to it before The Matrix, something about corporations and stuff.
Johnny Mnemonic.
But anyway, yeah, apart from Goosebumps, I think my big introduction to it was Tales from the Crypt. The intro was nightmare fuel when I was growing up. I mean, kudos to the puppeteers. There's Creepshow, the movie. I didn't see that until a good while later, but that basically gave me the same vibes as Tales from the Crypt, very similar format. And I forget if it came out before or after Tales from the Crypt started. But as far as movies go, I would say my introduction was probably Jaws. That's like my earliest memory of, an R-rated experience. I mean, of course, it was tons of people say, it was PG when it came out in theaters, and I'm just like, whatever, man. It was the first time I saw a guy get bit in half. He was spitting up blood. That they had a severed head underwater with one of its eyeballs missing. Like, Jaws would absolutely have been rated R if it came out today. The standards for the MPAA, I'm not sure what they were thinking rating it that when they did back then. And granted, 70s and 80s PG movies went a lot harder in terms of what they could get away with. But not a chance in heck it would be PG by today's standards. It's just, I've held this opinion for years that, like, the MPAA are idiots. Their standards change like the seasons. And they've always been subjective, of course. But,
there were some other movies that, when I was younger, I fell into the Stephen King, Pet Sematary, Christine, the movies like that. I tended to like to watch. What was the other ones? I'm trying to think. Can't recall the other ones that were out there, but there was a lot that would come up that you would actually watch. Anything that came into the realm of, let's say, like the Saw movies. I like those because they're thought provoking.
Yeah.
You have to kind of figure out, would you do the same thing that they're doing to survive?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of good horror films out there.
But When a Stranger Calls, I remember being exposed to that pretty young, but only, I think I was exposed to the twist in the story before I was exposed to the actual movie, because like the big reveal of like the calls are coming from inside the house. I knew that trope before I can recall sitting down to watch it, so I don't know if like Gran or someone else had told me about it, or maybe I saw a reference to it somewhere else on TV or in another movie, but it's like, by the time I actually watched it, I already knew what was coming, which kind of spoiled the impact of it for me. But I do remember that really kind of sticking with me for a while as a kid, the idea of just like this killer's or stalker, whatever, is stalking you through the phone, and the whole time you think that the house offers you like this barrier of safety, and then to find out at the 11th hour that like he penetrated your safe space from the beginning. I think it's just that really psychologically impacted me. I think it definitely made me paranoid about phone calls for a while, because like I'm a 90s kid, millennial, so I'm probably the last generation that's going to remember when most every phone was a landline. I mean, before cell phones really took off, and that was definitely scary, feeling like you had to kind of isolate yourself into this place where your one bit of communication with the outside is tied to a cord in the wall. And any movie or TV show where the phone line was cut, or someone did some kind of jamming thing to it, or messed with it in some way to where it wouldn't work, that was another layer of like psychological warfare there that really added to the impact of those stories for me, along with like urban legends and stuff. But before I saw Scream, the whole calls coming from inside the house thing, I think, was the first time I Yeah, I really never looked at a phone the same way after that. And then of course you had The Ring when you watch the curse videotape and then you'd get that phone call with the voice saying 7 days. He's in, and it's like I swear the first time I saw the opening to that movie, like I don't know if I finished it in one sitting because like it's like the first 13 minutes of Scream. The opening to The Ring is so good that it could almost be like its own short film. You wouldn't even need like the rest of the movie at that point.
That's similar to like Amityville Horror and what was it, Poltergeist, other movies like that. You know, so like the family is being attacked and they're in their home and yet they're trying to get out, but that there's something wicked that's there, that's kind of evil, that's taken over.
Yeah, it's like that familiarity associated with the household that kind of gets turned on its head. It's like, when the crap hits the fan, the first thing you want to do is go home, but when your home is the source of the danger, like with the family in Poltergeist, it's like the older teenage daughter character, she had a friend's place that she could keep going to, but it's like not everyone else in the family had that luxury, and it definitely creates a nice if I'm using this word right, a dichotomy or juxtaposition between the sense of safety in the home being kind of clashing with the fear of I don't want to be here, I want to be anywhere but here, but it's like, where is safe? And I think they especially tackled that well with Jaws, where it's like you have this idyllic island paradise that it is being circled in the water by this mostly unseen predator. And that's really one of the earliest examples that I saw of like a quality example of horror in daylight. Because most horror stuff, at least that I grew up with, you got used to seeing the creepy stuff happen at night. Then after Jaws and especially Tremors, like the first time I saw Tremors, you have basically Jaws in the desert. It's like day or night, these giant worms will just wait you out if you're sitting on a rock or you're on your roof somewhere. Like they can come at you any time, and no time of day is safe. It's like with vampires, you almost always have that established rule of daytime is safer, or nighttime is when you got to be prepared, and it's like any story that kind of goes against that dynamic that had been kind of programmed into me as a little kid, that really kind of opened the door to me for new possibilities of just new things to be scared of, and I continually would look for that as I got older too. Just trying to see new things, new ideas, things like that. Mm-hmm. Last thing I'll ask you is, in your opinion, what is horror and what is not horror? Like, what in your opinion, is the criteria that have to be met for something to be considered horror, in terms of how the genre has historically defined itself or distinguished itself?
I always felt like horror films had to resonate with you. It had to be something that causes you emotionally to fear what is on the screen. You have to feel like you're in the presence of the film, and not only that, but you are being chased yourself. If you can actually get, from a director's standpoint, to actually have your blood pressure heightened, your adrenaline running, when you're watching a movie, that is the key for me for a horror film. If it's something I can just watch, turn it off afterwards and go, that's not a horror film. That to me is a failure. But if it's something that, actually makes me concerned. Like I remembered, what was that one? The one that's got the person at the end, they're standing in the corner. It's like the shaky camera.
The Blair Witch Project?
Blair Witch Project. When I watched that, for the most part of the film, it didn't resonate. I was just kind of sitting there going, they run through the woods, no big deal. But the end, where the guy is standing in the corner, that creeped me out. And so that was kind of like the catch for that movie.
Yeah, when I was growing up, like I was immersed in like the whole marketing campaign for Blair Witch, where they made it look like it was a real thing and these people were actually missing. Like I remember the website that was up with like their missing persons information or something. Like I can remember like it came out in 99, I think. I think I would have been, like, younger than 10 at the time. So when I was in, like, elementary school, like, all my friends and I thought that was real. And I can remember just watching this. It was, like, my introduction to found footage, but it was also kind of my introduction to a documentary style. Like, it's like we're spoiled for documentaries that go into, like, dark, creepy, real crime stuff today. I mean, you look at Netflix and Amazon, they give you, like, dozens of different choices for that. Yeah, but this was really the first time that I experienced something that made me think about horror that could happen in real life. Because that was right around the age when I first started to really the difference between reality and fiction, and in terms of horror that can happen in the real world versus stuff that's only in monster movies. Is that was around the age range when I think the line between reality and fantasy really started to click with me. And as far as the first thing to immerse you in that, it went hard. I mean, as it got to even when they were the whole second half of the movie, when they got into the woods and the creepy noises start coming at night, like way before it got to the house and one of them standing in the corner at the end. And the first half of the movie, I would say, I was more bored. It was more of a chore to get through.
Yeah.
But as soon as they get into the woods, I mean, I'm not a camping person in general. Like, I've been camping and enjoyed it before. It's not something I go out of my way to do multiple times of the year. I think what first made me kind of paranoid about being in a tent at night, like, even if my family was there with me, was definitely the thought of someone or something, watching me from the woods, whether it was a something supernatural or a slasher, an animal, whatever. Or it was just the idea of, again, being outside the safety of the home, but this time, it's like you're trying to be in the wilderness with only, like, a very thin layer of tent to protect you. And when you grow up not being around guns and hunting like I did, like, I didn't grow up doing that stuff, you feel much more vulnerable. Whereas even in a house during a suburban slasher movie, at the very least, you can usually ask, do you have a gun with you? Do you keep it somewhere in the house? A lot of people who go camping don't bring weapons with them because it's like, unless you're going hunting, why would you? Like, the Griswolds aren't packing like an arsenal with them when they go on vacation. Yeah, so I agree with that a lot, I think, in terms of immersion. I mean, some people would argue that, there are plenty of action and thriller movies that get your blood pumping or your heart racing, endorphins rushing, but those aren't considered horror. But I think the distinction there is what specifically is causing that reaction in you, because all anxiety reactions, as having anxiety myself, I can tell you, are not created equal. The physiological reaction may be similar, but the psychology behind the catalyst for it matters a lot too. And I do think there's a big difference between these whataboutisms some people play, where it's like you describe how your heart was racing in this horror movie, and then someone might say, and this is kind of a bad faith argument in my opinion, someone might say, well, what about Transformers or Face Off or Pulp Fiction? And like, those got me going into adrenaline mode. Would you call those horror films? And it's like, no, but I mean, you have to recognize that the brain chemistry behind that is different, though. Like, you're oversimplifying it for the sake of making a point that I wasn't really arguing against to begin with. It's like a lot of what goes into horror is, I believe, more psychological before physiological. And so many people, they focus only on the physical reactions to the point that they kind of start to overgeneralize it, or they make it more about what's happening as opposed to it, or how it's happening as opposed to why. So what in your opinion is a movie that is not horror, even though a lot of people might say that it scared them?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me see here. Something. Like, give me an example of what you would say, and I could probably get...
Well, I mean, we watched that trucker movie Joyride recently with Paul Walker and Steve Zahn. I believe we watched that the last time you were home. So would you consider that to be more horror or more of a thriller?
More of a thriller. It didn't strike me as a horror film, maybe because I am a trucker. It's like, okay, at times I could see where he might take that avenue, but I would hope not. But I mean, with something that would be considered a horror film, I guess, well, for me, if it has comedy in it and it's a horror film, it's not really like Scream, like you mentioned that one.
Yeah.
That one to me, it's more parody, and it's more of them, just trying to get a laugh or have something.
And Tremors as well, or the Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein and the werewolf, whatever.
Right.
Like, they technically incorporate tropes from the horror genre, but they're more horror comedies. And it becomes a question of, are they a comedy first and foremost, or trying to be horror first and foremost? Like, which genre is dominating the other? What is it marketed more strongly as? As Abbott and Costello, I would say that's marketed first and foremost as a comedy. You could argue the same with Tremors. Jaws has comedic moments in it, but I would argue that was marketed first and foremost as horror, or at least terror, or which to me is pretty much like a cousin to horror. I don't see those as mutually exclusive. But yeah, I definitely agree with you that a lot of it depends on and the kind of reaction that it's trying to elicit from you throughout the experience. Like, is it trying to make you laugh more, be scared more, or just be invested more in the drama of the characters?
Yeah, because I would see something that would be like a horror film would be like Psycho, or if you have something that someone has, I guess, like a chemical imbalance, or they're mentally unstable, something that somebody could just snap at any minute. That tends to be more along the lines of a horror movie for me. Like, I know I haven't seen the movie, but I know that you watched Candyman, and so that would be something that you might see more as a horror slasher type movie. I haven't watched it though, so I'm not certain. But I remember you had done some on that. But something that would be a horror film that it would probably be The Scream, that I just didn't kind of see as a horror film, even though it was kind of labeled as that.
Yeah, you thought it was more comedy, or
I took it more as comedy,
more parody first and foremost.
Yeah, it just didn't come across as a horror film to me. I enjoyed it. Don't get me wrong. I just didn't see it as a horror film.
See, I would agree with that beyond the first 13 minutes. The opening sequence with Drew Barrymore, I would say, is the strongest horror element that it has. Everything beyond that, I would say it starts immediately going more into parody. But the first few minutes, I thought, played it pretty dead serious. Whereas the Scary Movie series, which made fun of movies more overtly, like, I definitely would not. Even if there were moments that admittedly kind of creeped me out as a kid, and I definitely would not classify that as horror, or like that is far and away mostly comedy, even though it's based around parodying the horror genre, even though it's titled, Scary Movie. I mean, if you judge it just on its cover without actually watching it, then sure, I'm sure plenty of parents looked at it and thought, oh, maybe the kids shouldn't watch this, it'll give them nightmares. But when you actually watch the thing, you can tell that's obviously not what they were going for. I'm sure maybe some kid out there got scared by Abbott and Costello's horror movies too. But the more you pay attention to the intent behind how the scenes are constructed and the mood of the overall story, you can usually get a sense of the creator's intent there, even if the marketing doesn't always portray it very accurately. Especially in trailers. I mean, horror trailers have like a long track record of misrepresenting their products, much more so than I would argue other genres. All right. Well, Well, I think we're about ready to wrap up here. Bill, thanks for coming on. And,
Thanks for having me.
And absolutely, keep on trucking, stay safe out there, we will. We'll hopefully have you back on again sometime. Maybe to discuss another horror topic. For those of you ladies out there who are listening, unfortunately, he is taken. I know, tragic. But them's the breaks. I can't get Angelina Jolie either. So we're all suffering. Good night, everyone. A big hand for Bill, everybody. My first interview immortalized online. Please do not stalk him on the road asking him to honk the horn. Most truckers are way too tired to be amused by that horse shit. Unless you're a toddler, just Google a truck horn on your iPad and entertain yourself with that, preferably with headphones so your parents don't decide to finally put themselves out of their misery. We don't need any more frustrations slowing down traffic. There's too many accidents already. And so ends this episode of Horror Convos. For those of you still conscious after listening to the sound of my voice for this long, your complimentary gift basket is already in the mail. And thank you so much for joining us today. Once again, Horror Convos is available to listen to on YouTube, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. Like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell on our YouTube channel so you don't miss when new episodes are released. The algorithm is not your friend, and please don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments down below. What was your childhood trauma growing up? What experiences were the most formative for you? What media that you consumed qualify in your mind as horror? And which ones were you scared of just because you're a spineless little pants shitter? Be sure to vote on the next poll for what we should talk about on the podcast. On that note, I will say good night, be well, until we talk again.